This is part 2 of our study of the book of Daniel. We're calling it Faithful in Babylon. And I think most of us probably have an idea, some understanding of what the idea of faithfulness is. That loyalty, commitment, those kinds of things. But what are we talking about with this Babylon concept, and what is Babylon? So I want to define Babylon for just a few moments before we get started this morning. So the idea here is that there's always been a rival kingdom to God's kingdom, and it goes all the way back to the Tower of Babel. You remember the story in the book of Genesis. They get off the ark, they begin populating the earth, and the first kingdom that emerges is this kingdom of Babel, of all places. And that's the place where they begin building the tower. You remember the story. They build this tower, and God says, listen, if we don't do something, mankind will they'll make a mess of things. And so that's where God confuses the languages, and that's why we get the term Babel, to Babel, and it becomes Babylon, or that area. And so Babylon always represents sort of this rival kingdom to God's kingdom. In the New Testament, we might call it the kingdom of darkness, or the kingdom of this world. But there is a kingdom that is a rival to God's kingdom. What's Babylon for you and what's Babylon for me is a little different than what it was for Daniel. Daniel found himself in a physical, literal kingdom of Babylon, far away from Jerusalem, where people worship Jehovah, the God of the Bible, and they worshipped all kinds of other deities. We talked about that last week, Marduk being the supreme deity there. For some of us, Babylon is a workplace, because this world has a very opposing view of what life is all about. This might be the education system. It might be a political ideology. Anything that opposes God and His will and His word and His work in this world is evidence of that spiritual Babylon. And the New Testament speaks of Babylon in a spiritual sense, so I don't think we're stretching things at all to speak of it in that way. Isn't it interesting that this world says, my will be done, but in Christ's prayer, what does He say? Thy kingdom come, rival kingdom. And what is the evidence of His kingdom coming? Thy will being done. Where? In earth as it is in heaven. So John the Baptist, when he arrives on the scene, he says, repent, for what is coming? The kingdom is coming. And Jesus follows shortly thereafter saying, repent, for the kingdom is coming. And God was reestablishing through Christ this kingdom here on earth. Daniel found himself there literally. But you will face many tests in Babylon. Will you not face tests in your workplace if you're a college student in the educational environment? If you're involved in politics, wouldn't you face many tests? Because this world system is Babylon. It's against the Bible. It's against our way of thinking. These are opposing each other. In the New Testament it says, friendship with the world is enmity with God. They're in opposition. That's Babylon. Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, faced numerous tests. And you can bank on it. If you live godly in this world, you will face tests. And so I think this is a great place for us to start here. Defining the concept of Babylon as this spiritual kingdom that is opposed to God's kingdom. And Daniel, as we learned last week in verse 8 of chapter 1, if you want to turn there, that's fine. It'll be on the screens. Daniel was presented with a test, wasn't he? Right out of the gate. Are you going to eat the food that goes against the Mosaic law? Are you going to abandon the God of your forefathers and just fit right in Babylon and not raise a ruckus and not have any problems? Just do where we lead you, you will follow. What we feed you, you will swallow. That's what they wanted. And Daniel there was a test. Am I just going to go along? Am I going to keep my mouth shut? Eat food that I know is forbidden in the Mosaic law, drink wine, and eat all this stuff that the king has provided for us, but it goes against my commitment that I've made in faith. So he's presented with a test. And in verse 8 it says, Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and the wine which was given to them by the king. It may have also been not necessarily the kind of food, but it may have been an issue where the food had been offered to false gods as well. As we saw, that was a lingering issue all the way up through the book of 1 Corinthians. So Daniel had made this determination, and he and his friends now get together. So, verse 9, now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel, and he responded, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale or thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded. It was understandable. Nebuchadnezzar was a very ruthless king and a very powerful and arrogant man. As the stories will unfold here in the book of Daniel, you'll see that. So the person who's in charge of all of these hostages who have been brought to Babylon from Jerusalem, he's very concerned about Daniel's opposition to wanting to exempt himself from the king's food and the king's drink. If you become pale, if you become thin, it's my head on the line, Daniel. So we should have some respect for this guy because he's willing to go along with Daniel, even though really it's not Daniel's head that's on the chopping block. Literally, at the end of the day, it will be this man. Daniel spoke with the attendant in verse 11, who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Please test us, they said, for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water. At the end of 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food, and then make your decision in light of what you see. Well, the attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion. And he tested them for 10 days. Verse 15, at the end of those 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. So Daniel has been faithful to God. Now God has been faithful to Daniel. At the end of 10 days, Daniel's now given the opportunity to live his life in a way that's pleasing to God, even though he's in Babylon. Sometimes, let's just bring this down to the brass tacks where we live and work today. Sometimes there's an opportunity in the workplace. And Daniel's in the workplace. He has no control over who his employer is. Sometimes there's an opportunity in the workplace, and I'm talking especially to young people as you grow up and you move into a job age, to say to an employer, hey, I don't want to work on Sunday morning. I'd like to be at church. You can schedule me any other shift. I'll work the late night. I'll do whatever. But can I have some time off on a Sunday morning because faith and my family, that's important to me, and I would like to be in church. And a lot of times, especially if you're a good, hardworking employee, they'll say, okay. Now, not every time. We can't control that. But I think it's wise to at least ask, hey, can I have this opportunity to maybe not have to work every Sunday, or I'd like to be at church with my church family, maybe with the rest of my relatives on a Sunday morning. Now, that's just an example, something I think we can draw from this text. Daniel did it. The Lord prospered him in that. Why? Because Daniel was attempting to be faithful to God, and God was demonstrating his faithfulness then towards Daniel. At the end of the 10 days, everything was great. Now, look at verse 17 as we move through the text. So they're eating healthy, and I'm glad it wasn't me. I would not have liked to have just vegetables and water. That's the worst thing in the world I could imagine. All right, or maybe not the worst, but it's close. They were willing to do this for the sake of their faith, and they should be admired for that. So how did it play out for them? God gave them, these 4 young men, unusual aptitude. So not only does he make them look better, he's helping them to function. Now, some people have translated this into a Daniel diet, or, if you only eat fruits and vegetables and drink water, your brain will work better than everybody else's brain. That may or may not be true. I'm not ready to try that one yet. Okay? I have tried a Daniel diet, and it was very difficult. And I can't say that my brain worked any better. I was grouchy because I hadn't had coffee and sugar and the things that I enjoy. But God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. And in this culture, that was kind of a big deal, to be able to interpret a dream or a vision. And so kings or nobles would have dreams, and they'd say, I don't know what this dream meant. Have you ever had a dream and you thought, that one had to have some significance, but I don't know what the meaning is? Maybe you haven't. Have you ever had a dream and thought, I hope that didn't have any significance whatsoever, because that was really weird? I had one just last night. I'll tell you real quick. All right. So I dreamed that I joined the Army. And I'm 46 years old, and I dreamed that I joined the Army. And actually, Aaron, I dreamed you were the drill sergeant. Dead serious. Aaron Saga was the drill sergeant. And as my dream ended, and somebody maybe can interpret this for me. As my dream ended, I was jogging up the hill, and I was thinking, I'm way too old for this. Dead serious. That was the dream that I had. Like, I'm 46. Why did I join the Army at this age? Stupid little dream. Maybe, I don't know what it means. If somebody has the gift of interpretation, I can't wait to hear that one. Just thought that was funny. It just happened just last evening. Most of the time, I don't even remember my dreams. I just fall asleep and wake up in the morning. But these people put great significance on dreams. I mean, enormous significance on dreams. And so Daniel, having that ability, that really moved him up in the pecking order. Look at verse 18. When the training period, so they were at Babylon University for 3 years. When the training period was over and it was complete, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. All these men who had been taken hostages, probably not just from Israel, but probably from some other places as well. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You have to understand, this is the known world of the day, and these are the top students in Babylon University, so to speak, and nobody impresses the king, Nebuchadnezzar, as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom, balance, and judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians or the enchanters in his entire kingdom. And then the chapter 1 concludes with this verse. It's kind of an unusual verse. Then it says, Daniel remained in the royal service until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus. Now, that's kind of a strange place. Usually you would tell that at the end of the story, but this is at the beginning of the story, and it tells how long Daniel lived there. In other words, Daniel lived the rest of his very long life. He lived well into his 90s, we believe, just by looking at the dates. Daniel lived the entirety of his very long life not back in Israel. He never, as far as we know, ever made a trip back. And so God had arrested him out of the place where he was comfortable in his youth, brought him to a place where he was very uncomfortable. As we discovered last week, it was part of God's fulfilling his plan of redeeming his people, and he was going to bring them away, and then he was going to bring them back. And Daniel realized God's being faithful to his word. But Daniel lived the rest of his life in that environment. And after Nebuchadnezzar, there was another king, and after that king, there was another king. And so he made it not only through several kings, but through several empires, because it shifted from being a Babylonian empire to a Persian empire. Cyrus is the king of Persia, the Persian Empire. And Daniel was so well respected in what we might call a secular environment that no matter who took over as king, they said, we want that guy. I mean, there were a lot of hostile takeovers back in these days where a lot of officials got killed when one king came and they replaced another king. But Daniel was so valuable to the kingdom that no matter what happened, whenever the next king came or the next king, he continued to move up the ladder and serve whoever the king was. Not only does this mean that he lived a long life in Babylon, having never returned to Jerusalem, it also means he lived long enough to see an astonishing prophecy fulfilled. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 44, verses 26 through 28, listen to this prophecy. This was about 200 years before the captivity, about 150 years before this guy was born. So this is a long time before, and listen to this prophecy, it's astonishing. God is speaking about bringing his people back, and he says, "But I carry out the predictions of my prophets. By them I say to Jerusalem, people will live here again." Now, just again, let me give you the context. Isaiah is writing before anybody has ever been exiled from Jerusalem. He prophesies during some times when there were actually some really good kings of Israel. Babylon wasn't even on anybody's radar screen. At the time of Isaiah, you have a lot more problems with Assyria and Egypt than you do anybody coming from Babylon. So Isaiah is writing this several hundred years before the fact, and he's talking about not only God taking people away, but God bringing them back, just like it said in the book of Leviticus and again in Deuteronomy, that God would bring them back. So, "I will carry out the predictions of my prophets. By them I say to Jerusalem, people will live here again, and to the towns of Judah you will be rebuilt." Again, this is way before they had ever even been destroyed. "I will restore all your ruins. When I speak to the rivers and say, 'Dry up,' they will be dry." Look at verse 28. "When I say of Cyrus," Isaiah names a person who would not be born for another 150 years and not rule for about 200 years. There is no Persian influence right now in the world when Isaiah is writing this. It's Assyria, it's Egypt. And Isaiah writes, speaking for the Lord, "When I say of Cyrus," and he names a name, "He is my shepherd. He will certainly do as I say. He will command, rebuild Jerusalem. He will say, restore the temple." Isaiah predicted this hundreds of years before Cyrus was even born. It's astonishing. And don't you think that Daniel, who lived this really long life in Babylon and then became a ruler in Persia as well, he knew Isaiah's prophecies. Can you imagine the excitement of a 90-year-old man whose people have lived in exile, and the walls have been torn down and the temple's been destroyed, and it's been all this time, and all of a sudden, when he's in the palace one day serving, and somebody says, "Hey, you know, the next king's going to be this guy named Cyrus. He's coming up from Persia." Can you imagine what Daniel must have thought? Cyrus, now where have I heard that name before? And it is Cyrus of Persia who makes these commands and decrees to go back and rebuild. Isn't that amazing? And Daniel lives long enough. Now listen, he never gets to go back to Jerusalem. He never gets to go back and worship at the temple. But he's faithful. He's as absolutely faithful to God as he can be in the environment that God places him. In an environment completely anti-Jehovah. So what's that say for us? I mean, we look at our nation and we say, man, things are really trending the wrong direction. What if in my lifetime we're not even able to gather in a place like this? I think that's a real possibility in my lifetime. Do we quit being faithful? No, we got to find a way to be faithful. Even if the culture crumbles around us, even if we're in Babylon, we still have to find a way to be faithful. Daniel and his friends, it's astonishing their faithfulness to the Lord during this time. So what are the takeaways? The first one is this. This story is not necessarily just about Daniel's faithfulness to God, as much as it is about God's faithfulness to his name or his reputation, to his word, and to his servant. Now, I hope that we will be faithful to God no matter what comes our way, no matter what the culture looks like. If we find ourselves in Babylon, I hope that we will be faithful. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the story that's being written is that God is always going to be faithful to his reputation or his name. Think about the prayers in the Old Testament. A lot of them centered around the name of God. When Solomon prays that prayer, and we always quote the line that says, "If my people, which are called by, will humble themselves and pray and seek your face." Read that prayer sometime that Solomon prayed, because it's all about God glorifying his name through the events of human history. If the United States of America ever ceases to be a world power, will God still be able to gain glory? Yeah. Do you realize there's been many other empires that have risen and fallen that nobody thought would have ever fallen? And God still got glory. So let's not bank everything on how our country's doing. And I hope we do well. And you'll see from the Old Testament, we should look for the good of the society in which we live. We should work for the common welfare in the society in which we live. Absolutely. We should try to help our nation last as long as it can and be as great as it can and all of those things. That's wonderful. But I don't want to put all my hope in that. Because even if things crumble and things decay, not only can we be faithful to God, but God will still be faithful to His name. God will always be faithful to His Word, and God is also faithful to His people. In the book of Daniel, we're calling it faithful in Babylon, but it's really about God's faithfulness to His people, even when they were in Babylon. Secondly, God always prepares the place before He prepares the person. Just pause on that first sentence for a second. God always prepares the place before He prepares the person. He didn't create Adam and Eve and then make a garden. He made a garden. And He put Adam and Eve there. He says, I go to prepare a... And now He's getting us ready for that place. God prepares the place before He prepares the person. The place of leadership in the empire was prepared by God, and then God moved and prepped Daniel for that place. He didn't move Daniel there and then create the opening. It was ready. Think of Joseph in Egypt. How was Joseph being prepared? In Potiphar's house, in the prison, and then he ends up in the palace. God prepared the place, but God prepares the person. And so wherever God moves you, if you find yourself like, I'm in a new place in life, or maybe even in a new geographic place, there's a pretty good chance that God's been preparing you and moving you into that place. Maybe it's a place in your work where there's an advancement and God's moved you into a supervisor role or something. Well, guess what? He's been preparing you all along for that so that He can receive glory by the way that you function in whatever role that is. He prepares the place before He prepares the person. Lastly, you don't have to be in Jerusalem to be faithful to God or experience His faithfulness to you. You and I can be faithfulness. You and I can experience faithfulness in Babylon. I used to do a youth ministry, and it was in an urban setting. And one evening, as we were having, we had a Monday evening Bible study, and one of the kids was telling a story, and it wasn't entirely true, and so the other kid began to call them out on it. And she said, and I can't say it as good as she did, she said, "Girl, you're lying in church." And I thought that was really interesting, and I kind of stopped the lesson right there. Because what's the implication of that? That somehow it's worse to lie inside of a building, inside of some rectangle made of blocks and wood, than it is to lie outside there. It's wrong to lie no matter where you are. And I think we can't compartmentalize our lives. We can't say, well, I'm going to live for God when I'm inside these walls or I'm around these people, and I'll experience God's faithfulness here, and I'll experience God's goodness here, and He'll experience my faithfulness towards Him here. But then when I'm in Babylon, it doesn't matter where you are. You don't have to be in Jerusalem. You don't have to be within the church walls or among God's people to be faithful to Him or experience His faithfulness to you. You and I can be faithful in Babylon and experience God's faithfulness there as well. Father, we thank You for Your great love toward us. Lord, for Your astonishing faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies we see. Great is Your faithfulness. Lord, indeed, we are not like Daniel. Most of us, admittedly, Lord, we would say we have not been very faithful to You throughout our lives. Certainly, Lord, You know that of me. God, sometimes we have a desire to be faithful, but the world sways us. We allow ourselves to be deceived. And even in those moments, You're still faithful to us. And You're still faithful to Your word, faithful to Your reputation. So we thank You for Your great faithfulness. And I pray that You would help us to respond to Your faithfulness by living lives of faithfulness, whether among Your people or whether we're out in Babylon. Help us to be faithful. We ask that in Jesus' name. Amen.